In a new piece for 538, technology and politics reporter Kaleigh Rogers takes a closer look at the larger legacy of Donald Trump's false claims about the validity of the 2020 election.
Kaleigh found a, quote, anti-democratic shift among the GOP catalyzed by the big lie and ushered in by a network of right-wing power brokers. She cites a growing amount of bills in state houses intent on restricting access to the polls, as well as trends of illiberalism amongst GOP members of Congress. Here to expand on her reporting is Kaleigh Rogers. Welcome to Rising, Kaleigh. So tell us, what are these bills that you're seeing, this growing number of bills that are restricting access to the polls? How are they restricting the access? Where are they happening?
Right, so we tracked more than 500 bills. About 50 of them were actually passed into law, and they were across many different states. They address voting restrictions in a number of different ways. So everything from requiring voter ID laws where there were none before, voter roll purges, to more extreme laws that we're seeing in states like Georgia, where the state legislature has more control over local election board officials and things like that.
So you kind of get the sense generally that there's less interest among a lot of Republican leaders in the idea of elections, the idea of democracy, that's much more of a power game, like you said, like Republicans ought to be the ones that oversee the counting in Georgia, like that sort of thing. But what else are you seeing where you're able to quantify this shift?
What we're seeing really is, I mean, the quantity, the number of bills that were introduced is really striking because we haven't quite seen this level of new voter restriction laws coming in. And to some extent, that makes a lot of sense because there was so much voter expansion due to the pandemic. You would expect to see some of those being rolled back as we go back into kind of more normal election cycles. But it goes even beyond that. And in speaking to individuals who were either pushing for this legislation or actual state legislatures who helped get it passed, a lot of it is being funneled or fueled by belief in the big lie. So constituents think that there was something wrong with the 2020 election, and they want to see their lawmakers respond to that and do something about it. And so this is how a lot of Republican lawmakers are responding.
And by restriction, what precisely do you mean? So you're talking, in-person voting rather than ballots being mailed to people's houses, or, ballots having to be signed, or like that kind of thing?
Right, so there's a wide range, and some of them, people might argue are not as big a deal as others. Some of the experts I spoke to, Jake Grumbach, for example, from the University of Washington, made the point that if you're introducing any kind of barrier to voting, no matter how small, if it's not addressing a specific problem or security issue, then that is voter suppression point blank. That was his opinion. And so everything from, voter ID laws, it's harder to vote with a voter ID if you don't have one than to not be required to use a photo ID. That's just the reality. It just makes it harder to vote. Whether or not you think that's enough that it is suppressing the vote, that's a legal debate, and in some states there have been lawsuits brought forward making that case.
I mean, you need an ID card to walk into a restaurant now.
Right. Well, and I think
I need two of them. I had to show a vaccine card and an ID to go to dinner last night.
And I think, Kaleigh, a lot of people watching this,
I don't think that's voter restriction.
Right. They'll just seize on voter ID and be like, you ought to have a voter ID. All of this is kind of fake news. But I think that there's a couple of different buckets here. So the one bucket is the different restrictions that are being put into place to try to move the margins so that, if previously a Democrat might have won in a district or an area by 51%, you put in enough restrictions in, now they end up with 48%. So that's one bucket. And there's a lot of complicated ways they go about moving boxes, like you said, purging rolls, et cetera, even separating out voter ID. But then there's another bucket, which is who controls the machine of the kind of deciding who won the election, like who counts the ballots, and most importantly, kind of who certifies the counting of the ballots. And you're starting to see a drift towards state legislatures wanting to take control of that, so that if they feel like there was fraud, that they put it to a vote in the state legislature and say, there was fraud, this election's thrown out, we declare that this person is actually the winner. So how much of that bucket are you seeing?
Right, so that was actually the smallest bucket. I categorized all of the bills that we were looking at, and that was the smallest. That's much more rare than, for example, expanding voter ID laws or voter roll purges.
Where is that happening?
So we're seeing that more in some of the bigger sort of swing states that are getting a lot of attention. So, for example, we did see in Georgia where they were changing some of the laws so that the legislature had more control over local county election boards. They, stripped the Secretary of State, who was a Democrat, from her role on the state election board, and opening doors to have more authority over how elections are run, how votes are counted, and things like that, and giving that power to a partisan state legislature.
I was under the impression that legislatures were always the ones who were supposed to be in control of the counting of the votes and just the election in general, and that they sort of created these other commissions in order to sort of push the responsibility somewhere else.
Well, they're supposed to sign. They have to sign off on it, the legislature.
Right. I mean, the way that elections are run, and because the states have so much power, that is true. I mean, it was always the case that at the end of the day, the state legislatures could send a different set of electors to be counted if they so chose. This is just opening additional pathways to gain even greater control among the state legislatures.
And is this being done? This is being done explicitly in order to elect more Republicans, not just as a way to kind of play to the pro-Trump MAGA wing and make that contingent look, oh, hey, we're doing something. It's not just performative. It would have a real effect.
Well, it's difficult to say. So we're seeing sort of like a culmination of many different bills that makes it really hard to study. Like we've seen, for example, that expanding mail-in voting, for example, doesn't necessarily benefit one party or the other. So it would serve to reason that restricting mail-in voting wouldn't serve one party over the other either. There's research backing that up. When we're adding all these things together, it's a little hard to make predictions. As far as the intention behind it, every lawmaker is going to have a different motivation for it. Some of the ones that I spoke to, though, felt very strongly that they were just trying to make their election system more secure to try to assuage some of these fears that have bubbled up because of the big lies. They have constituents saying, like, I don't trust the election system anymore. What can you do to try to tighten things up? And they look for ways to do that. So, for example, I spoke with a state senator in Montana, Mike Cuff, who helped get a number of laws passed there. And he told me that was his motivation. He wanted to restore trust in the elections. So they looked for little kind of nips and tucks that they thought were reasonable, would not restrict voting to a crazy level, and would hopefully restore some of that trust.
Sounds like it's a lot of work tracking all of this. I mean, state by state having to do this is a lot of work. And I mean, great for you for doing it. I'm curious if there's anything like this kind of happening on the Democratic side of the aisle that you're also saying. I would imagine that I understand why maybe right now the GOP is more looking to do something to sort of restore trust in people who say, oh, this election was a sham. But are we also seeing Democrats doing things to maybe expand the vote? And what are those things?
Well, these were largely introduced by Republican lawmakers and in Republican-controlled states. However, some of the bills that we tracked were either sort of sponsored by both Democrats and Republicans. And so there is some Democratic involvement even in these voter restriction laws as well.
Okay.
As far as, yeah.
Fascinating. Well, we got to leave it there. Kaleigh, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And we'll be back with more Rising right after this.